Welcome, everyone, to the Canadian Ecopsychology Voices Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network. And today, Linda Bazell, one of the co-creators of the Ecopsychology Voices interview series, will be interviewing Jerome Bernstein. Linda?
Thank you, Carol, and I think you're doing amazingly well with your jet lag. Carol's just back from a tour of Europe. So I'm really excited today that we're going to be having a conversation with the legendary Jerome Bernstein. And I'm going to start by reading a very short biography for those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting him and reading his amazing book. Jungian analyst Jerome Bernstein of Santa Fe, New Mexico is the well-known author of Living in the Borderland, The Evolution of Consciousness and the Challenge of Healing Trauma, published by Routledge. This paradigm-shifting book deals with the evolution of Western consciousness and the emergence of what he calls the Borderland, a spectrum of transrational reality that may enable new possibilities for understanding and healing our relationship with nature. And I also want to add, since this is a very political day, that Jerome has been in the federal government and has been a consultant to mayors and a governor, as well as a registered lobbyist on Capitol Hill, in addition to being a psychoanalyst. Well, I can't resist starting with that one, Jerome. You've got to tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, about my political history?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess for me, that started in the 60s President Kennedy was elected. And then, of course, as you know, he was assassinated, and Johnson, LBJ, became president. He started the war on poverty. And so I was the deputy director of the Manpower Division of the Community Action Program.
Wow.
And and I also was in charge of research related to poverty, more literacy. Prior to entering government, I was a research coordinator with the Institute of Educational Research, and we worked on literacy programs.
Oh, that's great.
And then when I was out of government, a friend of mine and I started a social science consulting firm. And it was right at that time that the US government passed legislation giving Indian tribes the right to run their own programs, because up until then it was pure colonialism, still is in many ways, but that was a big shift. And so all of a sudden, these tribes who knew nothing about bureaucracy, budgets, evaluation forms, all that stuff, were handed, in the case of Navajo, who I was lobbyist and consultant for, they were the largest tribe, still are, I guess, in the country. And all of a sudden they had millions of dollars, and what do you do? So I was invited out as a consultant, and actually, this is while I was still living in DC, and that's very pertinent, because my first trip to Navajo, which is very large, 52 million acres, size of West Virginia, I didn't know anything about Indians. And I went to the library and got a bunch of books, and figured I should know something before I go. And the first book, the author was Gladys Reichert, who was a very good anthropologist. But I figured that Reichert was not an Indian name, was a Navajo name. And I decided that if I was going to have to work with these people and and be of any value at all, I had to understand them from their point of view, not another white person's point of view. So I took all the books back and I went cold. I didn't know anything. And long story short, when I returned, I was there for a week, traveled the whole reservation, met with lots of people, mostly listening. And when I returned to go back to Washington, I went back to Window Rock, which was the capital of Navajo Nation. And and it was late. Distances were long, and I didn't expect anyone to be in the office. And when I came in, where I had some of my belongings to get them and go to the airport, there were 3 or 4 men sitting at a desk, and that's very unusual there. So I was very quiet and didn't want to interrupt. And one of them got up after a while and walked over to me and he said, "We've been waiting for you," which really surprised me because I had concluded on this trip I had nothing to offer, and that I was going to tell them they needed to find somebody else, that I just didn't have anything of value to offer. And the fellow who came over to me said to me, and this is a direct quote because I've never forgotten it. He said, "We've been waiting for you. We've been listening to you listen. We want you to come back." And the idea of someone listening to me listening blew my mind.
Yeah.
And opened up a whole nother dimension of reality. That was 40-some years ago. And so being lobbyist for the tribe was my last federal government activity. And and during my consultancy out there, I had a lot of, I was in Jungian analysis. I was making a commute from Washington to Window Rock, which is in Arizona, and to New York, because by the 3rd year I was a consultant, I entered Jungian analysis. And during that analysis, I had many, many dreams about healers. And that's what turned me towards going into training as a Jungian analyst. And here I am.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. So how did this bring you to the idea of that the Western ego is undergoing a real change now in terms of reconnecting with nature and the transrational? How does that fit in here?
Well, with my book, it first started out as clinical. And in my book, I think it was chapter 3 or 4, I talk about this one patient, Hannah. And Hannah was very, she's what now I would call a borderland personality. And she was as attuned, more attuned to nature by any definition, and animals particularly, than she was to people. And that was characteristic of most of the borderland patients that I had worked with. And so when I started working with her, there was this dramatic event where she lived about 40 or 50 miles. She had to commute for her analysis. It's a rural area. And she got stuck one day after a session behind a pickup truck carrying 2 cows, which she was convinced were being carried to slaughter. And she became very depressed and very distressed and came to the next session talking about that. And I did what I was trained to do. I gave classical analytical interpretations, and every time I did, she would get angry.
Mhm.
And she would say, no, it's the cows. And then I would give some other interpretation. And she would get angry and say, no, it's the cows. You just don't get it. And the third time that happened, she was so angry, she took her shoe off and she was slamming the floor, screaming at me. And I thought she might hit me with the shoe. And she kept saying, you don't get it, you don't get it. And finally I heard her. I wasn't getting it. I didn't know I knew what I was doing wrong, but I didn't know what was right. So I decided to shut up and listen. And when I did, I fell back onto the kind of listening that I had learned over the years at Navajo and also Hopi. I have very close ties with Hopi tribe too. And it's a different kind of listening. It's being able to, actually, let's get that one slide up because it says it. Which one? Here it is, I think. Slide 12. It's a different kind of listening. And it's very quiet. It's very quiet, and one has to be mindful that there is more happening than what appears in front.
Mhm.
Yes, it's 12. Nope. So, nope, it's okay. I'll read you the slide. And it's an aphorism that I have at the bottom of all of my emails that after I returned from that, no, it's about a year after I returned from that first consultation at Navajo. And it says, we see and hear what we are open to noticing.
Mm.
And that's what I learned when that man approached me.
Yeah.
Was that there were things going on there and I just simply wasn't open to noticing because I had this very left brain, rational mindset, which doesn't fit theirs very well at all.
Yes.
And so that's what opened up to me in that moment, that and a whole nother world, a whole nother dimension of reality.
So can you tell us more about the borderline personality? Is this somebody who is psychic? Are they highly sensitive, or have they learned this different kind of listening? How do you think this happens in people?
What just happened and what you said, and incidentally, your face is frozen on my screen. But what you did just now and didn't notice was you asked about the difference or the characteristics of the borderline personality, and it's Borderland.
Excuse me.
Well, my choice of the word was with full forethought. I did choose it in part because it does, for anybody in psychology, it does allude to the borderline personality. And the reason I did is that so many people, and mostly women, I don't know if there's statistics, probably there are, but I haven't looked it up. In terms of the borderline diagnosis, it's overwhelmingly women who carry that diagnosis. And in the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, that's a pretty serious pathology, can be a serious pathology. Mm-hmm. And what I came to realize after that session with my patient was that these were people who were noticing, or let's say being noticed more by the collective psyche and the collective unconscious than other people. And that if you go down the characteristics of borderline personality, incidentally, I don't use diagnostic categories hardly at all now. But if you go down the list of characteristics, one of them is an unstable self-image. And what I found was that although there was a lot of overlap between Borderland and borderline personalities, one of the things that was radically different was that the Borderland personality had a stable identity. It didn't break down, it didn't shift. And usually it was hidden because most of these people really relate to nature in a very direct way. So the patient I was talking about, for example, she became suicidal actually whenever I gave her classical interpretation. But after a while, when we had a more secure relationship, I asked her why didn't she take her life? Said she felt it, or what kept her? And she said, my dog. And her dog at that time was her closest companion. And then I began to notice that if I use the phrase or use the definition in any context, it was like people started coming out of the woodwork. And when my book came out, I was pretty intimidated when my book came out because I knew that it was radically different. It was challenging a lot of the standard clinical models that psychologists and psychoanalysts are trained in. And I thought, oh dear, I'm going to be stoned as a kook and as a weirdo, a new ager. And so when my book finally came out, I was cringing and expecting real criticism and so forth. And to my amazement, I started getting emails and letters and phone calls from all over the place. I still do. And one of the characteristics of Borderland personality, the first publication where I used the word Borderland personality was in the year 2000. So that's 18 years ago. And see, I forgot the point I was going to make.
Well, I could certainly ask another question that might be related to this. I know in your book, which I hope everybody's going to get because it's amazing, that you talk about how there's a dark side as well as a light side to having these Borderland capabilities to be especially attuned to the rest of nature.
Right.
Sounds like some of your patients, like Hannah, actually had a very dark experience with that connection. And I know you've also written about people with environmental illness complex.
Yes. Right.
So there seems like there's definitely two sides to this. It's a gift and yet a sometimes painful one.
Yes, absolutely. Although a lot of the downside, the dark side, had to do with people, and that's the point that I didn't remember a moment ago. The dark side is that at that time, again, my first publication was 2000, so it's 18 years ago, 19. these people were like 3 standard deviations out from the norm. And talking about, they're talking with animals and animals responding to them,
Right.
talking to trees and that kind of thing. They knew if they went around doing that, they would be considered crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of borderland personalities really live parallel lives where they hid, including from their own family, where they hid their borderland nature.
Yeah.
And for, I would say, at least half and maybe 2/3 of the borderland personalities that I worked with hid it totally. I was the first person they had ever said anything like that to.
Yeah.
And it was having something in writing that also gave a name to their experience that did not say they were crazy. And that's what they feared. And so, I, for example, I got an email from one woman who, she had 2 sons, and she hid what she later realized was her borderland personality. Having a name for an experience that is out of the ordinary, that's transrational, is really, really important, most particularly if it's not coming out of some book on pathology.
Right.
And so this woman wrote me, and she said, she thanked me for writing the book, and she said, these are her words, she said, "I finally came out to my youngest son."
Mm.
And what she meant was, she sat him down and she said, "Now, I want you to know," he was 20. And she said, "I want you to know that when you were little, I know I was different than the other mothers. And I'm sure I look strange to some of your friends." And she went on like that. And she said, and I've worried all my life that this is going to have a bad impact on you. And at which point he said, "Mom," he said, "you were strange." And he said, "That's what was so interesting about you." And my friends really wanted to know more about you. And then they didn't think she was crazy, nor did he. He thought she was gifted. But since it was never talked about, it was never talked about.
Right.
So, and then as time went on, again, that first article was in 2000. This is 19 years later. What I began to notice, and this goes back to your original question, was what the borderland traits, which you might think of as not a hypersensitivity, but a hyper feeling connection with nature. It's a natural phenomenon, and being all those years, from that first time I went out to Navajo, which was 1971, I have never been not connected with Navajo tribe and culture to this day, or Hopi tribe and culture. So I was going between 2 worlds, and the language structure, the psychic structure, is radically different than the Western structure. So let me see if this might help. Let's know. We'll get back to that in a minute. Oh, you can't see what I was doing. Oh, we'll do that. So what I began to realize as more and more of these borderland traits began to show up in the culture. And let me explain what I mean by that. So after a while, I began to notice things like Whole Foods, for example, one day announced that they would no longer have lobster tanks in their fish department. And they were gone. And I haven't seen them in any grocery store in years. And that was out of consideration for the animals, for the lobsters. And then the New York Times Magazine, which is in this country a premier publication, started publishing strange articles. Like the cover story of one magazine was watching whales watching us. And which is not unlike what that man said to me at Navajo, except it was watching, not just listening. And things like that. And then I began to realize that these characteristics of the Borderland personality, including the environmental illness, there are some Borderland personalities who, because of early childhood trauma or maybe extra hypersensitivity to things in nature, most particularly things that are put into nature that aren't part of nature, like fertilizers and chemical fertilizers and chemical poisons like Roundup and so forth, where some of them become extremely ill, physically ill, which is called environmental illness. To the degree that I've seen people who could only live in a tent in the backyard because the toxicity from building materials made them acutely ill. And for, I don't have numbers, but for a significant percentage, not a majority, but a significant percentage of Borderland personalities, they do have environmental illness. Yeah. And one of the things I began to realize, I would have people come in who have had therapy. And after they read my book, I would say to them, well, what did your last therapist say about your Borderland connection? And they would look at me and say, well, you don't think I told my therapist about that? and I said, oh, and I appreciated that because it was truly, truly frightening. And more and more, these characteristics began to show up in society, not only commercially, but in newspapers and sports and everywhere. And that took me to thinking about it in terms of Jung's theory of the psyche, and particularly the collective unconscious. And what I concluded was, you know, we have had ages. We had the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Age of Reason and so forth. And they emerged and they ran their course, and then due to growth and entropy, both growth and entropy, they would become depleted, the energy would go, and there would be a period of chaos in the transition, and then we'd move into another era. And so what I came to realize after a while was that what was going on was that the psychic paradigm that prevailed in Western culture, which was ours, United States, since Franklin Roosevelt was president. He was elected in 1932 and took us through the Second World War. After the Second World War, it was the age of US dominance. And I put that together. The second chapter in my book is called Genesis. And I do see the story of Genesis, and particularly the Garden of Eden story, as the foundational myth of Western civilization. So, so when I was out at the Indian reservations, you know, I'd be leaving New York or Washington, D.C., very different from Indian reservations and native cultures, and I would find myself in this other world. And it was very stark. I mean, the differences were profound. And I began to sit with that. And then I realized that what was happening, I thought, that the paradigm that had been prevalent in the West, which was the U.S. paradigm and dominance, post-World War II was collapsing. And that something new was entering into the collective. Because when we use the word evolution, we typically don't think of psyche, we think of biology. Mm-hmm. And psyche evolves just as much as biology does, and much, much, much faster, much quicker pace than biology. And so, and the other part of that, in Darwin's theory, Darwin held that organs and species that became over-specialized became extinct. And so in the Garden of Eden story, when humans are created, they're given a mandate of dominion over the earth and everything living on it. And and that worked okay for a while. And then we became as a species, and in the Western psychic mode, what I call the dominion psyche, we became inflated by that and addicted to the power complex and what we call progress and wealth. And I'm looking for a slide that shows, here it is.
I think we're probably going to want to take a break here and
okay.
Open up to the questions of the people who are attending this live. But I just want to thank you so much for sharing this with us. I know there's so many people who identify with being Borderland in different ways in their lives. And your work has really given permission for those of us who have these experiences to raise our own voices and be more out front in the culture, which I think desperately needs to hear, as you say, some completely different ways of understanding the world that we live in. So I just want to thank you, and we'll open it up for questions from those who are attending live.